Welcome to Rewiring the American Edge, the podcast where we explore the intersection of innovation, automation, and policy to ask one big question. What will it take for cities, industries, and people to thrive in a rapidly changing world? I'm Billy Riggs, urban planner, researcher, and technologist. And with my co-host, Vipul Vias, we talk with global thinkers, policy leaders, entrepreneurs, and many more to explore how to build more competitive, inclusive, and resilient economies in the U.S. and around the world. Join us. For today's episode, we're focusing on code, and our all-star guest, we're thrilled to have a civic tech pioneer, somebody who focuses on the rules of government and how we shape it. Marci Harris, CEO of and co-founder of PopVox, helps really shape how people engage with Congress. A friend and former congressional staffer, trained lawyer. I think one of the most thoughtful voices on digital democracy that I know. Always a pleasure to have you on board. And we've mentioned Matt Mahan, who's mayor of San Jose, who actually connected us, which is it's a very friendly group we have here. So thank you for joining us, Marci. I hope I've done a decent job providing your intro, and maybe you could round it out a little bit for us.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much. And yes, shout out to Billy's Mall, and shout out to Mayor Matt down in San Jose. And Vipul, it's great to be here with you. Yeah, Billy, as you said, been in civic tech a long time. Back when we started popvox.com in 2010, I always tell people we thought we were going to solve all the problems of Congress with a website, and we didn't, but we learned a lot of lessons, including what it means to sit in the middle of the Venn diagram between Congress and technology. So I live on the West Coast and do most of my work with DC, but I'm originally from Tennessee, so I kind of keep the perspective of lots of different places around the country, including teaching down at San Jose and being a fellow fan of the work that's happening in the city of San Jose. Not just that they're leveraging AI for their own work, but that they really have built out this GovAI coalition, bringing together cities from around the world to share, or around the world, maybe just around the country, but there have been a lot of cities getting together and sharing, what they're putting in their contracts or what they're hearing from vendors, or, how they're deploying different apps, what ethical questions they're asking, how citizens are responding. So, our work at PopVox Foundation, which is the nonprofit that we founded in 2021 to take the lessons from popvox.com and apply it in its appropriate charitable home. But we at PopVox Foundation focus a lot on legislatures, primarily at the federal level. But, we really believe that it's important for these democratic institutions at all levels and all around the world to share what they're learning, because everybody's figuring it out at the same time. We're all at the starting gate together on what Gen AI means for democratic institutions, for governing, and for lots of other things that policymakers need to have a position or weigh in on. So it's an important time to share information. And great
That's
to be
great.
here.
Yeah, thanks, Marci. And maybe just from a background standpoint, so you got to PopVox originally just from a legal career, wanting to influence kind of from a policy standpoint with technology. Can you explain that trajectory a little bit?
Yeah, well, so let's see. I'm trying to figure out how far back to go. So I worked in Congress right after law school for the Ways and Means Committee on the Affordable Care Act. You might have heard of it. And you may have heard that when the Affordable Care Act got passed and over to the executive branch that then went to implement it, there were some issues at the implementation stage, the rollout of healthcare.gov. So being kind of part of that process and seeing how much congressional committee and staff is bombarded with information at the legislative phase, and how much language and decisions made at that stage impact what happens at the implementation stage was massive aha moment. But the original genesis of the idea for popvox.com, again, back in those early idealistic civic tech Web 2.0 days, was let's take all of this advocacy that I was on the receiving end of as a staffer from, lobbying groups and advocacy groups and grassroots organizers and others. It was the first time that Congress was kind of receiving all of this digital advocacy So the idea was to bring it all online in one website and let the public see what Congress was hearing, which was a lot. So, we built the site. We delivered millions of messages to Congress over the past 15 years. We also found that we weren't solving the issue we set out to solve, which was making sure that people better understood what was happening. And there was a lot of we call them frequent flyers and others using the site for advocacy that was not super productive. So we shifted gears in about 2017 to working more directly with committees and staffers and others to try to prototype different tools or think about ways that they could get information to better inform policymaking. So we've been working on that ever since. We think that Gen AI provides a lot of opportunity for better data-driven lawmaking, better focus on outcomes, even better ways to engage with the public. We're just kind of at the beginning stages of what's possible with all that.
Yeah, so I think that's where we want to go next. Where do you see the problems, and what are the solutions that you think we can work on there with Gen AI?
So, I mean, the problem that I'm obsessed with, that our organization is obsessed with, is the pacing problem. Not my original term that came from professor at ASU, but the idea that tech, as we all know, develops exponentially and policy doesn't, and policymakers don't. Their knowledge doesn't increase at that same rate, which means if we don't do something, that every year our democratic institutions are further and further behind the technology that's changing our society. So our mission is to help democratic institutions keep up. And that means everything from helping them have better tools and processes and better capacity and talent among their people internally, to deploying those tools to make better policy, have tighter feedback loops as a program is implemented, to see what the outcomes actually are in the world, and ideally be able to go back and adjust in a more agile way. There, you can see that I learned a lot from my time in Silicon Valley, and I think that there's a whole lot to be learned from the practices of modern software to incorporate into the lawmaking, the oversight, and the refining process to ensure we've got policies that are more responsive to the world.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Vipul, you've worked in the software industry, and I don't know if you'd want to weigh in on that as well in terms of your background working in the tech space.
I would agree with Marci that things are changing fast from a tech perspective relative to the past. The rate, I guess the second derivative is increased in terms of acceleration. We're accelerating at a faster rate. And so I think it's going to be even harder to keep up. And in that context, there's a few trends actually happening, or two. There's a variety of convergent things happening in society. Trends is maybe the best word for them, but you're having the slow displacement of the older population of leaders with younger ones. At the federal level, institutions are pretty ossified, I would say, or maybe that's not the kind word, but they're pretty set. They're established is maybe a better way to observe it. And at the local level, there's more dynamism, or just by the nature of things, it's more fluid. And so I see a lot more swap out occurring. I mean, you see that in New York. Whatever you think about the specific policies or political philosophies, the establishment folks, I think both Cuomo and Adams were boomers, or are boomers rather, and they're being displaced pretty aggressively by younger folks.
Please.
And so you're going to have a much more tech savvy, tech comfortable set of folks. I mean, there are people in the boomer, demographic who just don't use email that much. Forget like anything more sophisticated. That's not everyone. There's a lot of people who do, obviously, but there's just that big digital divide because they didn't grow up with it in the same way that generations that came after them did. So that's going to be a big change. And the second thing I think is that it doesn't necessarily have to be government or government leadership that does it. That there's an opportunity for government to actually expose data, expose information outward, so that people, the average person, can inspect and interrogate things. And the real template for that, I think, and Marci may know better because I don't. I don't have a right to an opinion, but I have one. So this is COVID, where everyone was publishing their infection rate data, their vaccination data, all that was for public scrutiny, and it was scrutinized. And I think that's probably the model where people, can look at the budgets, can look at things in great detail themselves and interrogate it easily and quickly because you have AI. But part of it is making that stuff available. And this is where I actually see the intersection of AI and the now long forgotten darling of yesteryear, blockchain, where you actually do have open trackability coupled with AI, because now you're going to have transactions that happen across many parties where no one person owns that quote unquote ledger. And so the intersection between those two things enables everyone to be able to interrogate what's happening and understand what's going on. Because in large urban contexts, I think Matt Iglesias may have said, and I'm quoting him may get me in trouble in itself, but it does have an interesting insight in that whenever you have this concentration of wealth that you have in typical urban areas, you have the ability for certain interests to capture power and extract wealth, and do that in a pretty systematic and deliberate and maintainable way. And so what you want to do is potentially prevent that from happening on an ongoing basis or any substantial way. And this is the best way to do it, to have people just being able to see. So I'll stop there. I think so. I'm basically saying you can work with the leaders, which was Marci's point, but which is great. I think that makes sense. But you can also just make government much more transparent, and there's no reason for it not to be in this era.
I'm definitely in favor of government transparency. I do think, part of the optimism of the early OpenGov days was that we were going to make it transparent. Don't get me started on how many transparent things were PDFs. And now we can actually parse those PDFs. But you're going to make it transparent, and then everybody was going to turn into a watchdog. And, to a certain extent, maybe, but also people have lives. And so, with the exception of things like COVID, where there was great interest, and you saw a lot of folks doing a deep dive, it's, we actually are living in a world when there are fewer journalists to parse that data, and fewer resources to actually analyze it, and we actually see the watchdogs being defunded as opposed to ramping up the capabilities. So I think that's one. But I do agree with you that Gen AI actually produces perhaps a new wave of opportunity for the original kind of hope of open government to actually play out. And well, let me just say, my dream of that is less individuals, going in and spending their Saturdays parsing the data. We hear a lot of talk about the potential of agents, and I think everybody's thinking about agents being deployed in governments or businesses, et cetera. I get excited about civic agents and watchdog agents and oversight agents. And so I think the next phase of Gen AI and Gentic AI might actually bring us to that beautiful potential that we talked about, decades ago.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. One thing I was just going to add is what I noticed in San Francisco is there's a lot of citizen journalists, if you will. There are, and I do wonder what they do with the rest of their time, because it's a fair point. But they're the ones who actually uncovered or identified a lot of the issues. I think in almost, I'm going to put a figure on it, more than 50% of kind of, they spent money on that, or someone did that, or they decided made this decision. It's really come from the sort of blogosphere, if you will. The other thing, from within government, I don't know if you guys follow, and I'm going to butcher his name, Ken Magia, the city controller. Los Angeles city controller. He has an amazing Instagram site where he actually is kind of like Mandami. He's like he has a rap. He has like a couple dance numbers that he does where he explains the city's data and the city budget to people in a super entertaining and relatable way. And also, gives sometimes dire warnings about the city's financial health. But that's probably a little bit of the future too. And that if you can get even people in government to make things honest and relatable and entertaining for that matter, it can create a compelling level of engagement.
Yeah, we should put a link to that in our show notes, because that sounds pretty darn cool, but not as cool as your friend, the skater librarian, Vipul. We have a skater librarian here in San Francisco. Our head librarian is a skater.
Librarians are cool in all their stripes. I'm pro librarian.
Okay, but I'm gonna be the downer here. I'm gonna I think we have to kind of situate ourselves a little bit amongst the people who are out there and listening and skeptical, and because I do think there's a fair amount of people that may be sitting out there thinking that there's a dark side to the AI future, and what happens when things go wrong, like the healthcare.gov rollout, or when the result is big, slow, and expensive, and there's not a timely rollout for technology. So I guess, is there a counterpoint to this argument that, oh, this AI thing, it's not going to work? And I guess my argument would be to those people, hey, this is not new. We've done this before. Agile government is not a new experiment. Marci, can you talk a little bit about some of the work that's been done with the US Digital Service and some of the original experimentation with evolving some of the agile governance, human-centered design, and open source tools? Because I think we skipped over a lot of the evolution that Jen Pahlka had already started within governance and in the Obama administration, that really has set a lot of this stuff up. And I really feel like our audience needs to understand this didn't come from nothing.
Yeah, and certainly a lot of innovation has happened over the past couple of decades. I am a very, very big Jen Pahlka fan. For those who are not familiar, so she was in the Obama administration. She founded Code for America, wrote a book called Recoding America that documents some famous examples of these kinds of projects that Billy was just describing, digital services, attempts to upgrade and fix legacy systems, and the different places where they ran into issues. I am working pretty closely now with Jen and some of her colleagues at the Niskanen Center and Foundation for American Innovation, Federation of American Scientists, also FAI, to close, what we describe as feedback loops. So you have a lot of folks who work in digital services on the ground trying to deliver services better, but often what gets in their way are policies that are designed for different eras, or unintentionally place roadblocks in the way of implementing a program. If you're trying human-centered design and the humans tell you it needs to work one way, but the policy says it can't, that's a problem. And so what's the feedback loop for the folks on the ground building the tech or delivering the service to let the policymakers know, and in the case of the federal government, let Congress know, hey, we're working to implement this program, but we need this law changed or this regulation changed, et cetera. And those feedback loops haven't worked very well over the past decades. And so part of what Hotbox Foundation and others are working on is trying to make those feedback loops more effective. But yes, US Digital Services and 18F and others, those teams have now been folded into the DOGE service under the government service, the GSA, General Services Administration. So there's all kinds of pieces being moved in the executive branch, and I'm not quite sure exactly where they've all landed. And certainly lots of good folks who have departed from federal service. And, and also I think that there are lots of attempts to deploy technology for automation in areas that, people who are not super familiar with government might think, well, that's just easy. Let's just automate that. Not understanding all of the different layers of policy that get in the way. But all of that said, I think we're at a weird place where those kinds of efforts are massively politicized. I think there's a lot of good people with a lot of knowledge who've departed service, and just in general, kind of a weird time to talk about this stuff. But if you talk about it in a general way, taking the politics out of it, I think there really needs to be a new approach to what are the services we're trying to provide. Does the policy as written, what is the outcome it's trying to achieve, and does it enable that outcome, and how are we carrying that out? And does the way we've been doing it make sense? Is there something that can be automated? And so, I think there are some opportunities for some well-designed, responsible experiments to be piloted over the next several years that are going to improve service delivery beyond what is possible now. And And I will steal from Jen Paulka and say you got to compare it to, don't compare it to perfect, compare it to the status quo. And often the status quo is if you've applied for, VA benefits or Social Security disability insurance, you may wait years for a determination of whether you're going to receive that benefit. Well, I mean, I don't know about you, but I personally would rather get an instant denial and be able to start my appeal understanding what it is that, wasn't approved as a part of my application.
Yeah.
Rather than waiting for 2 years and have the uncertainty of whether I'm going to get approved. So I think rethinking government services in general, we've got a lot of opportunity to do that. And tech is often the easy part. I know I'm not a technologist, so I shouldn't really say that, but really often the hard part is going back and figuring out what is intended, who can make the determination about how we're going to do this, who's got the power to change a requirement or to approve an agile process or a product-based process as opposed to some terrible waterfall legacy system, and how do we rearrange the institution around what needs to be done, and
Right.
the building it
Let's
part is
call the tech the plumbing. We got to design the roadmap or the architectural drawings before we plumb the house.
But sometimes it's so clarifying when the engineers are asking the questions. You're like, yeah, right. Actually, it doesn't make sense. I know you're right, but it's the engineer that can call it out and say, yeah, what you're describing actually doesn't work.
That's so fascinating. So, okay, if we were to step back and then just kind of look at some of the stuff you have been working on more recently, because you're situated right now, and you said this before we got on, that you're actually sitting right now, I believe, in Norway. So you're sitting at a really macro scale. What should we be rewiring the way we do legislation in the U.S.?
Yeah.
I see some amazing things happening down in San Jose. The mayor is very AI forward. I think it's unfortunate. In some ways, I feel like AI has bailed out San Francisco from itself, and that's happened multiple times. Things that happen in San Jose ultimately benefit San Francisco in inordinate ways. This is my general belief situated here in Palo Alto. But Matt Mahan is doing a lot of things. He's got an AI initiative. Most of the cities in the peninsula, for example, use AI for language translation to promote inclusivity. And I think Matt Mahan recently said that Hispanic engagement in San Jose civic discourse has increased by 300%, so city council meetings, etc. And that is because you simply now can apply translation services in many more interpretation specifically, in many more contexts, because it's cost effective or cost possible, I should say. And, I know that the current administration designated that the U.S. have now a official language by executive order in March, and that's English, and we've never had one before then. But that doesn't, belie the fact that this is a pretty diverse country, constantly evolving, constantly changing. And so you're going to have populations in many of these urban areas that it's not just English and Spanish, but it's English and many other languages. And many times you just can't find an interpreter for Gujarati or Vietnamese. And oftentimes you need two interpreters because one is not enough, etc. So that's just an example of how that technology is coming in, making government more accessible and more inclusive for more people in a cost-effective way. But there will be, in other cases, resistance. We can see it with, Billy, your own experience with autonomous vehicles in San Francisco, right? And there's legitimate reasons for resistance in some cases, and in other cases, it's potentially unfounded fear, but that's what's going to have to be navigated. So I'll stop there.
The way that policymakers understand this technology, and we think they ought to be using it and understanding, its opportunities and its limitations. But we really care about how the government, especially the policymakers, are using this technology to better understand, what they're working on. And, I think the future is outcomes based. So the future is, okay, lawmakers, you just got elected, you came to Washington, you know what you ran on, get in a committee room. This is what you said you were going to optimize for, whether it's name that thing, health, economic growth, better environment, whatever it is. Get in that room and talk about how you're going to know when you've achieved that outcome that you ran on. Like, how are you going to measure that you've achieved the outcome? And then let's back up from there to some policy options. My goodness, AI is fabulous at presenting options and running scenarios and things like that. Let's talk through some policy options. And then let's write a law that says that we're going to leverage our federalist system, the fact that we have lots of opportunities for Kentucky and Tennessee and California and New York and Maine and all these wonderful states and territories to implement based on what they need in their communities. Set the metrics at the agency level. Let 1,000 flowers bloom in terms of implementation strategies. Let every implementation be its own experiment. Standardize data so you're comparing in real time what's working, what's not, what's the bounds, where the outliers are, good outliers and bad outliers. We've got good outliers. Let's go find out what they're doing and share that information across the cohort. And let policy implementation be a local, you can have your community participation process at the local level, and let it be, a learning process as implementation happens, and report back to Congress, or let them see in real-time dashboards what's working, what needs a tweak, what needs refinement, and, really leverage this technology for making policy that works.
Okay, that sounded really, really high level, but it also sounded really ambiguous. So are there specific guardrails you're talking about, or specific things that when it comes down to brass tacks and policy with regard to kind of like things specifically that you're suggesting when we're actualizing and we're writing legislation? And so are you making specific suggestions to the United Nations or things like that when governments are writing policy? Are there things that you're suggesting that when policymakers are going in and they're using an LLM for writing policy, are there nuggets that, like, when a local council member is using an LLM to write policy, or should they be? Is that a stupid move?
Not at all. No, we're actually prototyping a tool right now. We call it Policy Sandbox. That it's basically designed for a staffer, LLMs to model policy. And I'm happy to go there if you want me to.
How would we talk to somebody so Matt Mahan apparently is doing all his talking points with ChatGPT these days. That's very interesting to me. Are there strategies for perhaps going in and having certain policy language and then structuring that language in a policy format? Or are there things that you're suggesting to policymakers in terms of the way that they may pivot between different formats or things like that? I'm just curious if there are tacit recommendations you would have.
Well, so we're actually, yes, absolutely, they should be using the various tools that are out there, not just because it substantively is helpful for them in, talking through different policy options, but also it helps them gauge how the various models are working, what their limitations are. Are they perceiving bias? How does Gemini compare to Grok, compare to ChatGPT and Claude, et cetera? Policy Sandbox. Right now it's using the OpenAI API, but we can shift it to, Claude or others. But it actually is a RAG system that's got, Congressional Research Service, Government Accountability Office, and Congressional Budget Office reports in its system, and lets a staffer kind of talk through, well, I'm thinking about a policy on this. And then it says, well, has your boss ever made a statement about that? What's their background? And they're like, well, he says this and this. Well, what committee is he on? Should we tailor it to the jurisdiction of that committee? And then, have you thought about, how you would like this to be implemented? So it's basically a co-pilot for a staffer who's thinking through a policy. Now, the output of that is not legislative language on purpose. It's instead a policy memo that a staffer would take to the very professional lawyers that work in the Legislative Counsel's office in the House and say, here's my idea. And now you, very accomplished keeper of the code, please write this into legislative language. And, we talked to Leg Counsel about that, and they said, actually, that would be helpful because, sometimes staffers don't really know what they're asking. They don't really understand, various policies would work. So it's kind of walking them through the questions that Leg Counsel would have to ask anyway, but not using LLMs right now at this point to do the legislative drafting, because I think we still are quite a ways from that. But eventually we'll go there, but that's going to have to be a very careful process.
Yeah, so there would be a filter per se, kind of in an intermediary in the grand scheme of things.
I mean, I think at the stage we are now in even in coding, certainly in contract drafting, and these tools are tools. They're co-pilots, they're research assistants, they're thinking partners. They're not lawyers. They're not maybe they're paired coders, but I think we've learned recently they shouldn't be the full coder of the thing.
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing that. That's the stage we're in now. That's the stage we're in today. We certainly are, as they always say, we're dealing with the worst AI today that we ever will, and it'll be better tomorrow and into the future. But starting to lay the path for how we want it to help us is important. It's important to start now.
So any legislature or any public official that wants to use it for code should definitely be working through their legal counsel. So that's
and I mean, if you're a member of Congress or you're a state senator, you may have interns drafting your talking points or staffers drafting your speech. You usually read it before you deliver it. So, I mean, it's the same principle. Ultimately, you're going to be the one signing your name or voting for that bill or giving the speech.
Right. Well, Marci, I wanted to just say thank you to you, but also maybe offer you an opportunity for a last word. And if you had any kind of final reflections that you wanted to offer to me and to the rest of us. I know Vipul already had to drop off, but any final thoughts or time for a lightning round of advice you want to give to my mother?
I'm very glad to send a hello to your mother, and also just appreciate the conversation. I think my major point would be that I know there's a lot of folks who are in tech that get frustrated by the governing side of things. It's too important to ignore. And it's really important that, there's lots of folks in government that are ignoring the tech or thinking that they don't need to engage there. Nope, those days are over. We've got to all speak each other's language and understand what's going on in each of the worlds. And it is absolutely important that we bend that curve of the pacing problem and get democratic institutions at least at a little bit different angle in terms of keeping up with technology, because otherwise we're going to be lobbying tech companies to protect our rights in the future. Democratic institutions are really important and we need to preserve them, and that includes increasing their capacity so they can keep up with how quickly the world is changing.
That's right. Thank you for that. And I think it's not just, if we want smarter government, we need smarter code. And that's not just thinking what we build, it's thinking how we build it. And so I really appreciate the work that you're doing. Thank you for sharing a little bit of your journey with us.
Thank you.
I hope we can talk more in the future.
Likewise.
Yeah. So hope to see you soon. And thanks everybody for joining us today. Subscribe, leave us a review, and come back and see us next time. This has been Rewiring the American Edge, global conversations on innovation, automation, and the future of competitive cities. I'm Billy Riggs. Thanks for joining us. Our series is sponsored by the University of San Francisco Automation and Innovation Fund. If you're interested in supporting our students or work, reach out via email. Also, please connect with us on social media or LinkedIn. We would love to hear from you. Until then, all the best.